Welcome to episode 115. Thank you for joining us. This week, we welcome Adam Lazarus to the show. Adam is the author of the book The Wingmen, the story of the unlikely, unusual, unbreakable friendship between John Glenn and Ted Williams. Adam has also authored multiple books that focus on sports history, such as Hail to the Redskins, Best of Rivals, Super Bowl Monday, and Chasing Greatness. Adam talks to us about his decision to write this book, being that it takes a step away from the specifics of sports history and looks at the shared history of these two American icons. Within the public consciousness, this is a fairly unknown story of these two giants. It is one of friendship and the dynamics of a decades long relationship, sometimes contentious, between the men that existed behind the mythology. Shameless plug, if you enjoy our conversation with Adam, take a look at the January issue of Leatherneck magazine, where you can read an excerpt from Adam's book, The Wingmen. It's a great opportunity to read about these two Marine Corps aviators and see some amazing photos of the two during their service in the Korean War. Also, in the January 2024 issue is the article A Day in the Life of a MARSOC Critical Skills Operator, where freelancer and veteran Marine Matt Kaltreiter writes about the evolution of MARSOC and the qualities needed to become a member of this elite group of warfighters. And now, here's our conversation with Adam Lazarus. Enjoy. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners, thanks again for joining us. I am Vic. I'm here with Nancy.
Hi, everyone.
And we are super excited to be welcoming our guest, Adam Lazarus, to the show. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So Adam is an author. He has published 3 previous books, Hail to the Redskins, Best of Rivals, and Super Bowl Monday. But we are here to talk to him about his book, The Wingmen, the unlikely, unusual, unbreakable friendship between John Glenn and Ted Williams. As a San Diego kid, super excited about anything and all things and everything that has to do with Ted Williams. But also as a Marine, this is a topic that really hits home for me. So I'm super excited to dive into this. Thank you for writing this book. It was really. Oh yeah, I've been on it all day today. I keep saying like lead off, let's do this, let's wing it and all these things. It's in the blood now after having read your book.
I'm glad I had that effect on you.
Yeah, no, this is pretty soon I'm gonna start talking with my hands, talking about being inverted, Maverick and Goose, all that good stuff. But before we do dive into this book, Adam, would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and then most importantly, like, what was sort of the impetus behind this book?
I'm from Northeast Ohio. Like you said, I've been fortunate to write a handful of mostly sports history books. I get to tell stories about a lot of interesting people, and for this book, I've been very excited and enthusiastic about learning more about the Marine Corps. I did not serve, and just disclosure, I did not serve in the military. I was not serving in the Marine Corps or anything like that. So a lot of the elements of this book were, very foreign to me and new, and they were fun to explore. I was very fortunate to have many active and retired Marines helping me on the project. But this all started when I saw a photo. It's actually a photo in the book. I was on Veterans Day a couple of years ago. Someone posted on a baseball website or Twitter or something a photo of John Glenn and Ted Williams at their base in Korea during the Korean War, 1953. And it just had a simple little tagline that said something like, "Did you know that during the Korean War, John Glenn and Ted Williams served together for the Marine Corps?" And I knew a lot about both men. I knew a lot about Ted Williams. I'm a big baseball history fan. I knew all his records, and I used to go to Cooperstown as a kid every year. So I knew all about his not just his baseball records, but his service in the military during both Korea and World War II. But I had never heard this connection with John Glenn. And the same thing, I'm from Ohio, like I said. You don't grow up in Ohio without learning about John Glenn. So I knew a decent amount about John Glenn, and I had never heard. I was surprised that given how much I knew about both men, and having learned a lot about both men in different, avenues, baseball or the NASA element, or politics, or just plain old American history, that I never heard about this connection. And the first thing I did was I grabbed my book off my bookshelf. I had Ted Williams' autobiography, My Turn at Bat, and I said, "Was this really true, or is this photo just like, did they run across each other one day and someone snapped a photo of it?" And sure enough, in Ted Williams' autobiography, he talks about his serving with John Glenn and his friendship with him. And then I went on Amazon and ordered John Glenn's autobiography. Same thing, many pages on his friendship with Ted Williams. And the more I learned about it, I thought it was just a fascinating story and a really amazing intersection of American history.
Well, Adam, let me welcome you also to the show because today we're talking about two of my very favorite things in the world, aviation and baseball. And so, welcome and thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for
Um,
having me.
and I have to say, like you, I knew a lot about Ted Williams. I knew a lot, not as much as you, but knew a lot about John Glenn. And I knew they both flew in Korea. I had no idea until your book came across my desk that the two of them had been friends and remained friends later on. It was kind of I was shocked and excited to learn that little tidbit of history. Um, how did you uncover more? Because you've got so much detail in your book. How did you do all your research besides the two books that you just mentioned?
Yeah, those the traditional books, the history books, Glenn's autobiography, Williams' autobiography, and then there's been biographies, several great biographies on Ted Williams, a couple very, very good biographies on John Glenn, and those had some, tidbits here and there, and then the profiles written about Ted Williams when he died, uh, profiles about some other interactions he had with John Glenn, briefly mentioned the connection. So those were good starting points. But I think um, what I found was most interesting was uh, I was able to get letters that John Glenn wrote home to his family during the Korean War. They're in archives at the Ohio State University because his wife saved them and donated them. And that's shown a little bit of light on his friendship with Ted Williams, but also some of the missions he flew with Ted Williams. Similarly, there were letters from Ted Williams home to his mistress, actually, at the time. He didn't particularly mention John Glenn because he didn't really know that John Glenn would turn out to be an international superstar. But those were a very good starting point for me, finding letters a lot of families had written home to their families at home about their service in the war. So I tracked down some other pilots' children. Most of the pilots are gone who flew in the Korean War with Ted Williams and John Glenn, but several of the children still remain. And I talked to them and convinced them to send me a shoebox full of the letters that their mom had saved 50 years, 60 years earlier. So those were good starting points. Um, but there were three pilots who are still alive who flew with John Glenn and Ted Williams. They're in their late
Right.
90s. They were all very lucid and energetic. And, if you knew Ted Williams during the war, and then later it turned out you knew John Glenn during the war, you remember that and you tell people about it. So they have the same stories that I'm sure they've told at cocktail parties and events that they've run across, or some person they ran into in the library many, many, many times. So they didn't forget those details, and they were fortunate to share a lot of them with me. Um, so those were the best sources for sort of the personal stories of how John Glenn and Ted Williams interacted, and it also provided a lot of detail on what life was on like on the base, and that was important for me, was recreating that for the reader, to share what life was like on a Marine Corps base and in South Korea during the Korean War, flying missions every day, what kind of missions they flew. I learned a lot about the planes they flew, the rations they had, the O Club that they spent time at partying. So those were some of the best resources for uncovering a little bit about their relationship in the early years. The later years were much more challenging, because there is a long period in John Glenn and Ted Williams' friendship that they're not really in contact that much. But in their later years, particularly when John Glenn goes back to space at 77 years old in 1998, one of the first people he invited to attend the launch was Ted Williams. He personally drove out to his house in Florida to invite him. Ted Williams' daughter told me about that. John Glenn's daughter told me about that. So getting a lot of the details in their later friendship, particularly when Ted Williams is really dying, when he's in his late 70s, early 80s, and close to passing away, that was harder to uncover the facts and details about. But a lot of the people who were around there at the time were able to talk with me.
That's really cool. And sort of backtracking a little bit to talking about some of the pilots you spoke to, I was really excited when I saw that you had interviewed Woody Woodbury
Yeah,
from
Woody
the
was
same
great.
air group, because
Yeah.
I want to hear a little detail about that. He was a good friend of my father-in-law. They both lived down in South Florida, and they were
Mhm.
part of this aviation society called the Quiet Birdmen. And
Mhm.
my husband came home from attending with his dad, and he was like, "Hey, you got to hear about this guy I met. You might want to interview him for Leatherneck magazine." And he told me about this guy. I went and looked Woody up in our archives, and lo and behold, he'd been featured in the magazine in 19, I think it was the September
Yep.
1953 issue,
Mhm.
um, about his time in Korea. So what was that like talking to him and the other guys?
He was a great source for me. Robert Woodbury. I think he was Robert Woodbury Jr. and they called him Woody. I think he was
Yep.
from Minnesota. And he was a stand-up comedian, kind of a piano player, very popular at nightclubs, I think in Vegas and South Florida before Korea, so
Hmm.
after World War II. And he got sent to Korea. Right, I think he said he was on stage at some famous club in Miami at the time when the North Koreans invaded South Korea. Um, and He got sent to the base that Ted Williams and John Glenn were at, so he had a lot of stories. He shared with me great details. I don't really remember how I got connected with it. I think he was interviewed for, it may have been another Marine Corps publication, about maybe 10 years ago, and I caught up with the author and she gave me his contact information, and I called him pretty frequently for interviews and verify facts. And do you remember this story? And I remember. It's funny that you mentioned that September 1953 Leatherneck magazine article. There's a picture of him playing the piano in it,
Yep.
um, and he mailed me his copy of it. I told him, I
Wow.
said, I have a digital copy that I got off somewhere, and he mailed it to me. It was 70 years old almost, so I took very good care of
Wow.
it. But he was very eager to talk about John Glenn and Ted Williams, and the life on the base. He told me a great story that's in the book. I don't want to give too much away about going on R&R with John Glenn to Japan, and them deciding to buy a piano in Japan to bring back to the O Club because he didn't like the piano they had in the O Club, and you have to pick up the book to get all the details. But John Glenn had a very uh, uh, difficult odyssey back to base with the piano. So Woody was fun and very colorful in some of his stories. Told me a lot about the songs they played in the O Club and what life was like in the O Club. But just a great resource. And he was on a couple of the more memorable missions with Ted Williams. Told an interesting story about Ted Williams' crash landing and a Marine Corps, or actually, I think it was an Air Force captain or colonel, uh, t- asking Ted Williams for his autograph right after he crash landed his plane.
Yeah, I
So
remember reading that where he just like races out in his
yeah,
car onto the flight line. Everyone's thinking, oh, he wants to check and make sure the pilot's okay. Like, no,
yeah.
he's got handing him a piece of paper to sign it.
Yep, Woody Woodbury told that story, and I was able to put it in the book. But yeah, Woody was great. The other two pilots were just as good for a lot of the details, providing what life was like, what some of the missions were like. One of them had a story about basically Ted Williams aborting a mission because he didn't want to fly it. It's in the book. It sort of colors Ted Williams' history with the Marine Corps a little more than most people remember, because this pilot seemed to think that Ted Williams didn't want to fly the mission, so he basically made up the fact that his plane wasn't working. Um, that's up for debate, and you can read the book to decide how you feel about it. And another pilot did not like Ted Williams at all. Had very very negative things to say about him personally, which is kind of on par with Ted Williams. If you know anything about Ted Williams, there were a lot of people who didn't like Ted Williams, but he too gave me some details on missions. He was the one who told me, and I later on uncovered this more detail about it, that the Marines at the base in the squadron, particularly the younger and more inexperienced Marines, did not like flying with John Glenn. It wasn't a personality thing. It was that John Glenn was very aggressive and took a lot of risks in the air. And if you were his wingman, it made it very difficult for you if you weren't as good a pilot as John Glenn. And there weren't very many pilots as good as John Glenn. So I liked learning more about how it was kind of a nice take some of the sheen off John Glenn, who, if in every measurable aspect, is the perfect Marine, the perfect human being, the ideal American. Never made a mistake in his life, which is not true because no one's that way. But it was nice to hear some criticism of John Glenn. So it helped me keep the book from being a love letter to John Glenn.
Nice.
No one could blame you for that, though. A
Yes.
love letter to John Glenn.
I will say that, I mean, of all the people I've ever written about or explored a large chunk of their lives, John Glenn lives as close to anyone I've ever encountered. He lives up to the, whatever you wanted to say, as he said, clean Marine or goody two shoes, or however, whatever term, pejorative or not, you want to give him. He was a man of unimpeachable integrity and ethics and morality. And as much as, again, I didn't want to make the book a love letter to John Glenn because I'm a historian and journalist. But if you're ever going to do a book that comes close to that, I think John Glenn is one of the few people you could say that about.
He lives up to the mythology, huh?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of your research, one of the things that, I was captured almost immediately, was in your prologue, which, it's not too often that you get a prologue that really, grips you the way it does. But the thing that I found was so fascinating is how you found this person who had a link over, I guess the course of, a decade or so between the two of them. And there was such a great entry point into the book. Could you talk a little bit about that and where that came about? And
Mm-hmm.
I think I know the answer having read it, but if you could just elaborate a little bit on your prologue.
Yeah, I've done many interviews and book signings the last 4 or 5 months since the book came out, and very few people ask about this, which makes me think that they skipped the prologue because they don't think it's part of the book. And you know what? I was thinking about it while I was writing this. When I was in grade school and I didn't want to read the whole book, I definitely skipped the prologue. So it makes me think that maybe a lot of people skip the prologue. The backstory is there was a career Marine named Robert F. Conley, who flew in World War II. He had a very distinguished career, about 35 years, I believe, in the Marine Corps, served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, was just a remarkable man, became commanding officer at Cherry Point, North Carolina. A remarkable career. Had some battles with Chuck Yeager, some interesting tales of Chuck Yeager. The prologue was actually a lot longer, and my editor kind of made me scrap it because it was really long. It was much more of a mini biography on this man, Bob Conley, because I was fascinated by him, and his son was actually a great resource for me. But Bob Conley was from Michigan. He ended up at Muskingum College in Ohio. And he was a very good football player. He was the president of his fraternity. And one of the people who played on the football team with him and was in his fraternity was John Glenn, 2 years younger than him. And they go on about their separate ways after college and both end up in the Marine Corps. But it turns out Bob Conley rose very fast in the Marine Corps, was a major the early years of the Korean War. And before he got his assignment that he really wanted, flying in combat in Korea, with what was called flying the Sky Knight for an all-weather unit. I'm blanking on the name right now, but it was a very prominent post that he was the commanding officer for. Before he got his orders to do that, he was in an administrative role at Quantico, and one of his jobs was to choose and reactivate and contact reserve Marines for Korea. And one of the files that came across his desk one day was that of Ted Williams. And he probably wasn't a big baseball fan, so he didn't realize that when he saw this file, it was Williams Theodore S. May have been because the name was Williams and it was a common last name. He said, "Oh well, this guy fits all the criteria. Served in World War II. He's healthy. He's promoted several times. Now he's a captain. Well, he's going to Korea." And it turns out that was Ted Williams. And the prologue actually ends with one of his superiors calling him and chewing him out for reactivating Ted Williams because he set off something of a media firestorm. Uh, but I found that it was just by happenstance that Bob Conley, I think, retired to go live in Texas after his many years in the Marine Corps, and a local Texas sports writer had he had known the future in-laws of Bob Conley. Bob Conley's son was getting married to this woman who was a Texan, and they all had dinner. And for some reason, this local reporter in Texas was there at the dinner, and he just started talking to him. And because he was a sports writer, he eventually learned that Ted Williams was the person he was responsible for reactivating Ted Williams. So he wrote a newspaper article about it in this small Texas newspaper, and I found it, and I thought it was amazing. Didn't mention anything about John Glenn, but when I started backtracking, I learned that this was the same guy who was in John Glenn's fraternity and his football teammate. And I said, is it possible that these two guys, that this is the same guy, this Bob Conley? And after much, much, much research, I learned it was. And I talked with his son. I finally tracked down Bob Conley's son. And sure enough, he had helped his dad write something of a diary or a memoir later in life. And it turns out this is the same man, and no one had ever really explored this before. And I was fascinated by it. And I just thought it was such an amazing intersection and perfect for my book. Like, you couldn't have been a more perfect situation for my book. And I thought it was the right way to start off the book. And I'm glad it resonated with you, because it seems like you're one of the small group of people who don't skip the prologue.
Yeah, no, it was so fascinating. And I was just even as I was reading, I'm like, how did you come up with this? I mean, it is the perfect entryway into the book. And I just love the way it ends with him at 2:00 in the morning, just like, he's good. He's going to war, hangs up and goes back to sleep.
Well, it's fortunate. I pride myself as a historian on being very specific about facts, but especially like dialogue. I don't make up dialogue. I'm not like one of those, historical fiction books that like, this is maybe how it could have been. And I wouldn't have had that dialogue if it wasn't for Bob Conley's son, who wrote all these things down in something of a journal, memoir, diary. And that's exactly how it appears in this memoir that they wrote a couple years before Bob Conley died. But yeah, it had the dialogue and everything. It was perfect for it.
Yeah, that's great.
That's awesome. That's such a great little nugget of information, and kudos to you for digging until you found that.
Yeah, I was very fortunate, and you don't get that lucky. I'm working on coming up with the next idea for my book, and I don't know if all the stars will align the same way they did in this one.
Well, speaking of your books, one of the things I find really interesting, and I'm hoping you could elaborate a little bit on it, is how writing this book, like what it was like, because although obviously sports is a major sort of umbrella that this book falls under, sports history, because of Ted Williams. I mean, you're talking about a quintessential baseball icon. But yet the vast majority of the book takes place is in a military setting.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that like, sort of, I guess, shifting genres in a way, still staying within that same sort of umbrella, but then really delving into the non-sports life of this iconic figure, and then, also having it overlapped with an American icon at that. Like, what was that process like for you?
Well, I think the thing that I was cognizant about was, yes, the first half of the book is certainly a military history book. And I did whatever I could to talk to anyone with the knowledge that I did not have. Like I said earlier, active Marines who are still serving. I have a very good friend from college who's a major now, and over in Japan. He was very good about helping me with sort of the terminology, or just getting an understanding of how Marines would have thought or how they do think, or the culture, the Marine Corps culture, which I wanted to show a little bit of in the book.
Yeah,
But
that's a
also,
deep chasm, man. So I hope you have a good therapist.
well, I was again, I was very careful not to pretend to know show more than I know. But I also, like, I interviewed Marines, like I said, the 3 pilots who flew with him were Marines in their 90s, who were Marines 70 years ago. Um, so I did whatever I could to get their knowledge and use as much of their language and quote them as much as I could, rather than make assumptions. And then uh, I was fortunate to have several experts. A wonderful military aviation historian named Richard Hallion, Dr. Richard P. Hallion, became really my greatest resource for understanding everything about military aviation, not just the planes and how they worked and how the armor, the ordnances, what kind of ordnance they used, which was an important part to include, but also the strategies and what was risks that were involved and why they attacked targets the way they did. So to answer your question, I guess I just would embrace the fact that I knew nothing.
Mm.
I embraced the fact that I knew nothing and sought out as much information from experts or people with experience, at least, that as I could. But as much as that was an important part of the book, um, it's really a book about sort of friendship, or at
Yep.
least relationships, and particularly relationships that may start under something like serving in a war. So I really went about it to tell the story that way, that there were these 2 men who had nothing in common in every possible different avenue. They were on the polar ends of the spectrum, whether it was home life, politics, ethics, morality, all that stuff. And that's what the book's about. And that's how I tried to tell a story from the beginning to the end. And I did whatever I could to fill in the details of their Marine Corps experience, or later on, John Glenn's service in NASA, or his service in the United States Senate, or when he ran for president. So those were all in. I don't mean to generalize or trivialize it, but those were all sort of just the military aspect, and the same thing with NASA. Those are things were just details that I tried to fill in, and I tried to fill the details in as historically accurate as I possibly could. And to do that, I sought out as many experts as I could, and records and archives. I got tens of thousands of pages of Marine Corps command diaries, and Navy medical records, and Navy, uh, records of promotion, for both in the Navy and the Marine Corps, for both Ted Williams and John Glenn and some other people who served. So that was, as much as it was a foreign topic to me, the military and the Marine Corps and the Korean War too, because I had to show a little bit about what the Korean War was about. I used that as sort of uh, as enhancing the story, and it wasn't the main story.
So as you were doing all this research, tell me, are there things you learned that were surprising to you?
Um, yes, there are many things I learned that were surprising to me. For one, I learned I didn't really know much about Korea. I mean, I knew what I knew from history class, and things like maybe reading some books here or there. And I didn't watch MASH, so I'm not going to say that.
Uh,
But I think, to me, it's often considered the forgotten war, and that's something that John Glenn and Ted Williams were actually very active in helping to establish the Korean War Memorial in Washington D.C., because even Vietnam got a memorial before Korea did. Um,
Right.
Korea was the last, at one point, was the only major American conflict that didn't have a monument or a memorial in DC. And I think that is telling to how little we recognize what happened in Korea. I think it's sandwiched in between World War II, which is so romanticized in every way, in Hollywood, and people who served. My grandfathers both served in World War II, and even when I was a kid, I wanted to hear them tell stories about World War II. And then afterwards is Vietnam, which is such a troubled um, period in American history, that Korea is often forgotten. So everything about Korea, the urgency, the depth of all the need for the missions, and the advancement, Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps. That was a very early in the early stages, understanding this chronology of the Korean War, why it was necessary, why so many people were called, why Ted Williams was called to service when he was a Major League Baseball player who hadn't flown a plane in 7 years. So that was probably the first thing that I learned that was very surprising to me, all those details about the Korean War. But again, I mentioned this earlier. For me, learning about John Glenn and just the thought of those pilots who didn't want to fly with him because he took so many risks in the air. His nickname was Old Magnet Ass because he drew so much enemy shells and enemy fire that it was neat to me to think that uh, there were guys who didn't like, and there were not only the guys didn't like flying with him, which you would think like, oh, if I'd had the chance to fly with John Glenn, that would have been something I really wanted to do. Uh, but they didn't like flying with him, and there were people who didn't like him personally because of that. He said in the later years, he was desperate to go to Korea because the first 2 years of the war, he was stationed first in Texas, and then he got sent to Quantico, and he hated his assignment at Quantico. He was on the staff of the commandant's school. He was taking all these classes. He took classes at the University of Maryland. He was monitoring like all these exercises. He barely got to fly. They didn't get him to fly very much because he was the only pilot on the commandant's staff. He really hated his service in Quantico, especially because the Korean War was going on. And he said, I couldn't believe that had been trained for almost 10 years as a Marine, and I wasn't going to fight this war. That they needed people like me. Hell, they had reactivated Ted Williams. He didn't know that, but they'd reactivated Ted Williams. He begged to go to Korea, and he literally wrote many letters to his superior officers at Quantico saying, "Send me to Korea." And eventually, they said, "Stop sending letters, but we'll send you." So they sent him, and when he got over there, he said years later that his words were, "I was very intent on war making," like because I think he felt he had to try to make up for the lost time, and I think he felt also that he was one of the most experienced and well-trained Marines in his squadron, which he was. So it was his duty to go the extra mile. And a lot of guys didn't like that. They thought he was sort of a glory-seeking guy, risk-taking or whatever, thrill-seeking, however you want to put it. And there were people who did not like that about him. So I always thought that was interesting, again, because he has this reputation of being the clean Marine and Dudley Do Right, as he put it, in the right stuff. That it was interesting to see that. That was the thing about Glenn that really, he was very stubborn. This kind of spins off of it. He was very stubborn. He was very stubborn as a pilot. He was very stubborn in that way. His superior officers in Korea told him, you can't take so many chances in the air because you have inexperienced pilots on your wing. And he was stubborn about that, and you really didn't listen to him, and he got shot up many times from it. And I think that gave way to his later life. He was very stubborn as a politician. It's one of the reasons he struck out in his first 2 attempts to get to the U.S. Senate. It was one of the reasons he didn't have a tremendously effective legislative career in the Senate in 4 terms. And it's one of the reasons his presidential campaign went nowhere. So that was another thing about John Glenn that really surprised me. Again, I don't want anyone to think I'm beating up on John Glenn, because if you read the book, I think you'll see that he was a man of remarkable character, and a true American hero who belongs on the non-presidential Mount Rushmore of Americans of the 20th century.
Oh yeah, I would agree.
So that was something about John Glenn that really surprised me. What Ted Williams surprised me was, for one, everybody recalls, the people who don't know, and I didn't know this until I started writing the book, that he was like, the cliche about Ted Williams was he's the only man who was the greatest in history at 3 different things: hitting a baseball, fly fishing, and flying an airplane. And those aren't true. Hitting a baseball, I totally agree. He was a very good fisherman. That's a lot of people who I know. He's in the Fishing Hall of Fame. People who fished with him told me he was a good fisherman, not the greatest fisherman they ever saw. But Ted Williams was not a great pilot. I think he was a great pilot in World War II, flying propeller planes because of his natural ability and his eyesight and his physical strength. But he went 7 years without flying an airplane. And not only that, they switched to jets at the beginning of the Korean War, and he had no experience flying jets. So he wasn't a very good jet pilot. And John Glenn, even years later, although he often said, oh, he was the best wingman I ever had, he sort of let on in his later years that Ted Williams was not a great jet pilot. And so for me, it was another thing that I learned that Ted Williams was the greatest hitter of all time, but you would not say he was one of the greatest pilots of all time.
Interesting. And so shifting gears a little bit, and by the way, I want to backtrack again. I should have mentioned this earlier in the podcast for listeners who want to read more. First of all, the January issue of Leatherneck, we're publishing an excerpt of your book, which we really appreciate you letting us do that. So that'll give you a little taste of it, but you got to go buy the book to get all of this good stuff. And how have people? What's been the reception so far? How are people reacting to the book, and what group is reading it? Are you finding it's more sports enthusiasts or aviation enthusiasts, or are you getting a mix of all of that?
It's definitely been a mix. The baseball community has probably showed the most interest because, Ted Williams is one of those rare names, and probably not just baseball, but American sports, where you can just say the name and it perks people, people's ears perk up. So a lot of people, whether they're Boston Red Sox fans or not, have shown a lot of interest because of the Ted Williams element. But sometimes I've had people who've been interested in the NASA elements, and certainly the military. A lot of ex-military people, former Marines, and anyone who served in any branch of the military is often very interested in the book. I will say that I don't mean to get political in this podcast. It's not my intention. But for those of you who don't know, and you'll certainly read the book, John Glenn was a Democrat. He was a Democratic senator for 4 terms. Ted Williams was a Republican, a very right-wing, right-leaning conservative Republican, very good friends with Richard Nixon, endorsed many, many Republican candidates, helped both George Bushes win the New Hampshire primary when they ran for the Republican nomination in 1988 and in 2000 again. And I'm not going to talk politics or anything here, but the fact that John Glenn and Ted Williams were friends, despite very, very different worldviews when it came to politics, worldviews when it came to everything, but especially politics, has been something that a lot of people have responded to, especially in today's climate where, Republicans and Democrats often can't be in the same room together. But for me, it's been a very useful examination of how these two men who disagreed on so much in every aspect of life were still friends. And when Ted Williams is dying after, near death, having a 12-hour heart surgery in a hospital in San Diego, John Glenn flies across the country to visit him in his hospital room. And they're not arguing politics. They're talking about their service together in Korea. And, I don't know the specifics of the conversation, but I would imagine they talked about how bad the food was or how dangerous this mission was. And it's all about, it comes from a place of their shared experiences and their shared service to their country. So that's one of the things that I think a lot of people have responded to, that it doesn't really, this isn't a Republican book or a Democrat book or whatever you want to characterize it that way. It's a book about two friends and all they went through together and how long their friendship lasted for 70, 50 years. And I think it's a good example that maybe some of us could learn from, that politics doesn't have to invade every aspect of our lives, such as our friends.
What a great point to make, and what a great reminder.
Sure. What a great example to use. Again, these two iconic figures that, for all intents and purposes, like on paper, should have been, at each other's throats. But yet it was really, truly the exact opposite. Really fascinating. Along those same lines, though, of, service and sort of these things that really bind us together, a lot of times it's through adversity or through, these traumatic situations such as war. But one of the interesting things that I find in reading and having read your book was there are a few other athletes, obviously not nearly as prominent as Ted Williams, but who are also there in Korea that you had taken account of or gotten interviews of or feedback from their service. So I found it interesting. So sort of in the public consciousness, the fact that so many, there was an entire movie, League of Their Own, where so many professional athletes had gone off to fight in World War II that many of the leagues had to find alternatives or just shut down altogether. And so that was very much in the sort of the American zeitgeist of that time. To piggyback off your comment about Korea being the forgotten war, did you find that through your research of these two that other sports celebrities still were marching to the call of service, or had they kind of lost their appetite post World War II? What was sort of that sense of service, especially amongst those who could very easily get out of it?
Yeah, I think it's very complicated because um, it seems to me, I don't want to overgeneralize, but it seems to me every able-bodied young American male between the ages of whatever 18 and 30 went enlisted in World War II. Pearl Harbor had just been bombed. It was your duty, it was your responsibility. Ted Williams didn't want to go to World War II. He did what he could to get out of it. And then after a while, when he got a deferment to help pay, keep his mother financially supported, he got booed so many times. And he says that Quaker Oats rescinded an endorsement deal they had with him because of the bad publicity of him getting out of service, and he eventually enlisted in the Navy. Um, so I think it's kind of apples to oranges. Everybody went to World War II. It was your responsibility. I mean, like Rosie the Riveter, right? Everybody was doing their duty, doing their part. And Korea, it doesn't seem to me like there was that same sense of urgency for people to enlist. I imagine a lot of young people enlisted. I know, just from my own family history, I know that my grandfather had two brothers. He served. His one younger brother served, and then their youngest brother. They went to great lengths to make sure he didn't enlist or serve because someone had to stay with their mother. And then at the end of the war, he enlisted, and his two older brothers were ready to kill him because they said, "You were the one of the last to enlist, so if we go to war again, you're going to be one of the first people called back." And I think that was kind of the environment. Was if you had served a lot in World War II, it was likely you weren't going to serve the next time there was a conflict. That wasn't the case for Ted Williams. What happened for Ted Williams was he was reactivated because he stayed in what was called the volunteer reserves at the time, which you could do. You could resign your reserves commission, but a lot of those guys liked staying in the reserves, saying they were still in the Marine. They got promotions. They probably got um, compensatory pay grade raises. So I think it was a different kind of environment when Korea happened. And a lot of the guys that I did encounter who active major league ball players were also called back. They didn't actually enlist. There's a couple guys I mentioned in the book. I know that he's not mentioned in the book, but I think the great Dodgers pitcher Don Newcomb served in the Army for 1 year in Korea. I know Willie Mays served for 1 year as well, but I don't think he actually saw combat. But there are a couple guys who were reactivated. One of them was Jerry Coleman, who was a great second baseman.
Mhm.
He wasn't really a great second baseman. He was just on the great Yankees teams of the 50s. He went to service. He was friends with Ted Williams. He went to service in a different squadron in the Marine Corps. A guy named Lloyd Merriman, who was a very good prospect in the late 40s and early 50s. He too was recalled. Served in the same Marine Air Group as Ted Williams and John Glenn. There's another baseball player named Bob Kennedy who was reactivated also, but then he had many dependents, so they eventually sent him home before being deployed. But yeah, I don't think it was necessarily that guys were, you know, being expected to enlist or join the fight because of, I don't know if it was the proximity to World War II or if people didn't view the Korean War as quote unquote as important as what happened in World War II. But yeah, there were very, very few people in that celebrity baseball player mold who went to serve in Korea. And I don't really think any of them did so willingly. Ted Williams did everything he could to get out of service. He contacted lawyers. he tried to get a couple of politicians to pull strings, and ultimately it didn't work. But to his credit, once it was clear that he was going, he gave his all and flew his missions and did so without complaining, as John Glenn said many times.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about your book, and especially your prose, is how you, and I think this is your historian hat, but that, you definitely paint these figures as being very real people. And these aren't love letters. These are just retellings of like the things that happened, and that seems to be pretty uncommon these days, where everything seems to have a platform where we have to try to preserve the brand, sort of thing. But I guess along the lines of service, so then you like sort of fast forward, and I want to juxtapose your two books, Super Bowl Monday and then this one, where you see this sort of the dwindling of this um national call to service. And then, post 9/11, the only really prominent sports celebrity who, you know, air quotes I'm making here, answered the call was Pat Tillman. We don't really get much in the way of, a really a large sort of uh, call to service. There's plenty of, obviously, within the sport themselves, thinking of Yankee Stadium, just a week after the attacks, and um these sorts of things, but they're still in the sport. They haven't left. They haven't given up the celebrity to answer the call. What are some of the things that you've noted in that, or have you explored that aspect of our culture as we've, I don't know, sort of evolved, or celebrities become much more prominent than service, or what are some of the thoughts on where sports celebrities sit on this?
Uh, I wouldn't be lying if I thought that a lot of I look down on celebrity in a way. I look down on celebrity overall. I look down on sports celebrity in that same group. I think there isn't really, not when Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio played. I don't think the celebrity was quite the same as it is today.
Hmm.
I mean, the thing that I hear, not to get on my soapbox,
Please, that's
I,
what we're
I
Oh,
here
yeah.
for.
Get on your
well,
soapbox. You're
I'll
welcome.
just go mostly with football. I mean, I'm a big football fan, and I watch a lot of NFL, particularly, um, and the celebrations and the touchdown dances and the sack dances and all that stuff. I think that's because um, it's not so much that the guys are taunting, which in some ways they are, but I think that a lot of those guys they've been encouraged that they're entertainers. They're not athletes or sports figures. They're entertainers, and the touchdown celebrations are part of their brand, as you said. Their entertainment brand.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't think that quite meshes with the way ball players looked at themselves. They certainly thought of themselves as celebrities or stars or superstars or whatever. But I don't think they thought of themselves as entertainers. And I think when you have guys in with that mindset that their job is to entertain the public and be big charismatic and controversial, I think it's in a way it's more about them. It's all about me. It's very selfish kind of approach, kind of
Mhm.
selfish kind of attitude. And I wouldn't say every single player is like that, but I think there are a lot. And when you have that kind of mindset, I don't think sacrificing yourself for something like the military is something you're going to do. And give up your now 8-9 figure salary to go serve your country. Pat Tillman, I would be shocked if we ever saw another Pat Tillman to do something like that. And as much as Ted Williams was the highest paid player in baseball at the time of his recall to the Korean War, and that was one of the excuses he made for not having to serve, was it was costing him thousands of dollars a year. But he still did it, and I think in today's environment, if that were to happen, which it never would, he wouldn't have gone to war. the whatever athlete you want to pick, Mike Trout or Aaron Rodgers or whoever, if for some 1 in a trillion chance they were actually called to go serve, maybe 10, 15 years ago would be a better example, in Afghanistan, uh, it would never happen. They would find a way out. It didn't work that way because in the 50s and the 40s, I think, as much as these celebrities were superstars and part of the belonged to the public, I still think that everybody understood a little bit more about self-sacrifice and giving back to your country, and I just don't think we see that as much today. I think, and the perfect example of selflessness, and doing for the greater good is John Glenn, not just the Marine Corps and his service in World War II and Korea, but his test pilot work after the war, which was obviously not a headline-seeking thing. He did it because it helped make aviation airplanes better for the next war. And the same thing with the space program, sitting on top of 2 rockets in a tiny little box that had repeatedly blown up after liftoff, was his way of fighting the communists, or as he called them, the godless communists in the Soviet Union, but also advancing mankind's exploration of the space and the heavens and everything. And then later serving as a United States Senator, and also later running for president. John Glenn, I would think, is one of the this is something that I explore in the book. I think if my assumption of John Glenn is true, I think John Glenn is one of the only people in the history of America to run for president, not for glory or headlines or for his ego. I think he did it because he actually felt it was his duty to run for president. It was his duty. That was the next logical progression in his mind, was Marine Corps fighter pilot, World War II, Korea, Navy test pilot, NASA pioneer, United States Senator. Well, next on the progression is president, commander in chief. And I'm sure he would have liked the job for the perks and whatnot, but I also think that he ran for president because he thought it was his responsibility. I don't think we can say that about many people in the last 20 or 30 years who've run for president. So I think that generation, and maybe the preceding generation, not so much my generation or the one coming up, I think, did have a greater sense of duty. And my son is very interested in presidential politics, and not really the politics, just who the presidents were. He's 10 years old. He's very interested in Gerald Ford, strangely, right now. But he goes around doing, I'll do the John Kennedy impression for him. And he tries to do it. And he often says, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I think that would be laughed out of circles today. Maybe it was back then, but it's memorable and it still has meaning. And John Glenn, and in some respects, Ted Williams, I think, were the epitome of that idea.
Yeah, no, that definitely, these days, try not to be too cynical, but yeah, that definitely is probably more of a punchline in the Beltway than a mantra. Well, Adam, thank you so much for being so generous with your time, and for letting us talk to you a little bit about this fantastic book. Way to go. This was so fun to read, your anecdotes, just the depth and breadth of the research that you've done. It really creates a very tangible environment and picture, and you do a wonderful job of, like you said, sort of bringing to light some of the dynamics of this war that so many of us have sort of swept under the rug, or, like you said, sort of sandwiched in between these two other conflicts that are so much more on the forefront of American consciousness. So thank you so much for your time and for doing this.
Well, thank you. I will say, if your readers do pick up the book, if your listeners do pick up the book and they want to go to my website, which is just adamlazarusbooks.com, they can reach out to me and email me. My email is on there. And if they're interested in me signing a book plate for, dedicating or personalizing it for someone, someone who served in the Marine Corps or something like that, I'm happy to do so. Makes a great Christmas gift. So if you want to reach out to me through there, adamlazarusbooks.com.
adamlazarusbooks.com. Well, we'll be sure to put those into our show description. Where else can fans follow you? Do you have any of the socials?
Yeah, Adam Lazarus books on Twitter or Instagram. Lazarus A57, LAZARUSA 57 at Twitter. I created my Twitter handle like very, very early, so I've never changed it. I wish I had done something like Adam Lazarus Books, but I didn't. But Lazarus A57, they can follow me there. But definitely my website has all those links and links to buy the book and read more about some of the people who've said nice things about the book, other reviews. Yeah, that's probably the best place to go find me.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Well,
We
thank you
appreciate
so
you
much
being with us
again.
today.
Thank
Yeah.
you for having me. I really appreciate it.
All right, take care now.
Thank you.
Did you know that you can support the professional development of Marines serving today with a tax-deductible contribution? Marines benefit from the professional education resources we provide, and they also receive awards from the Marine Corps Association like the Chesty Puller Award given to every honor graduate at Marine Corps recruit depots. Make your charitable contribution while there's still time for it to be deducted from your 2023 taxes. Thank you for your support, and Semper Fidelis.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. I am William Truding, but you've also heard the voices or contributions of Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Lichman, retired Frazier. The opinions expressed in this episode do not reflect the official stance of the Marine Corps, DoD, or Marine Corps Association.